which lens you should buy for your landscape photography. If you could only have one lens for your landscape photography, which lens should it be? In fact, I'm going to answer it right now. The answer to that question is there is no answer. There is no one lens for landscape photography. And the problem is there's a lot of confusing, contradictory information out there, and they want to know which lens they should buy for their camera. And I'm talking about, well, generally focal length. So, you know, from super wide to a long lens, which is going to improve your photography the most. So what they might do is turn to YouTube and type in which lens should I buy for landscape photography, and what they'll find is lots of information. Some saying the 16-35 is the only lens they need, and someone else might say 70-200 is the only lens they need. But here's the thing, I'll try and answer this question as honestly as I can. There is no one lens, but that doesn't help you. It doesn't help the person who has a bit of hard-earned money that they want to invest in some new glass for their camera to improve the quality of their images or expand their photography. For landscape photography, these are not cheap. So yeah, unfortunately, the more expensive lenses, the much better quality images you'll get. Now, let's give you some practical advice very quickly before I move on to the more philosophical side of this debate about which lens is best for landscape photography. If you shoot seascapes, right, you spend a lot of time on the coast, get a 16-35, fantastic. If you like to shoot woodland images and intimate scenes, get a 24-70. You know, this is pretty much going to do you for most of your requirements. If you go hiking and you like shooting in the mountains, alpenglow on a snowy peak, that kind of thing, get a 70-200. That's it. That's about as much advice as I would dare give when it comes to lenses for landscape photography. Now, what you can do is you can go into Lightroom and you can see which focal length you use the most and then maybe upgrade that lens. I did this and I actually found the 24-70 and the 70-200 were about neck and neck. But then that doesn't help me much either, because I have images taken with the 16-35 that I absolutely love and can't imagine not having. So that doesn't help. The truth is, there are three ways to approach this. Three ways to approach the question of which lens or lenses should I have for landscape photography. Way number one is, you know, the affordable route, which is to get the holy trinity, such as this, but get the cheaper versions, so the kit lenses or the third-party manufacturers. But the problem with kit lenses is that the quality isn't as good. It isn't even close to as good as like a professional lens, and that's why there is a huge price difference. Now, kit lenses are great because they get new photographers out there and experiencing different focal lengths and what's possible, but in my experience, from me personally and from other photographers, you very, very quickly grow out of your kit lenses. After a while, you start to want to move up to something better. That's what this video is about. Don't know if you've noticed the edit. There's been an edit. But yeah, that's option one, kit lenses. But, you know, you might grow out of them in a pretty short space of time. The second option is to splash the cash and get them all. And I'm going to be brutally honest with you. That's what I would do. You know, I'm going to have to upgrade my camera soon enough. I'm on the Canon 5D Mark IV at the moment, and no doubt I'm going to upgrade to a later mirrorless model at some point. And with that, unfortunately, I'll need to buy new lenses. You know, I might switch manufacturer. I don't know yet. But I will have to buy lenses. And I'm in a very fortunate position that I do this full time, so I will want to buy all of the lenses, all the way from 16 all the way up to 400, you know, that 100, 400, 16-35, 70-200, all of them, every lens. But that, again, doesn't help most of the people watching. The likelihood is you're going to have a bit of money and you want to invest in one lens, only one, and that might be your go-to lens. Or perhaps you do a lot of hiking with your photography or long walks and you don't want to carry all of the gear. Which lens? Well, as I mentioned, there is no one lens for your landscape photography. The way to get around that question and to get past that question is to be okay with not getting the shot. Now, my photography has changed over the past few years, and one of the biggest changes that's happened with my photography is not the introduction of a new lens or piece of kit, but it is the acceptance of the fact that I won't always get a shot. That is liberating. I've been there. Trust me, I've been there. I used to be one of these guys. I don't have that fear of missing out because I know that the sun will rise again and the sun will set again and a new day will dawn and so on and so forth. The seasons turn, life goes on. So one of the biggest more positive changes to my photography of late is that it's the acceptance, being okay with not getting an image. Now, if you can achieve that, then you'll be much happier going out with just one lens, because you won't be looking for other shots that you can't get. And you won't be disappointed when you can't get the lake and the mountain in. Instead, you might be trying to create an image that's a little bit different by going in at a longer focal length and only getting part of the lake in or a part of the mountain. So yeah, it's tough and it takes time, but it's liberating and it's fantastic. And you really start to enjoy the true meaning of photography, or the true meaning of landscape photography, which isn't to be the biggest, best man on Instagram or woman on Instagram. It's to be out there, connect with the outdoors, and just have, a nice moment to yourself. So yeah, there you go. That's the answer. I go out with my film cameras, which only has 1 or 2 lenses, and I'm okay with not being able to get those shots. Now, I fully appreciate that if you're going on a trip, a very expensive trip overseas, a once-in-a-lifetime photography trip, then my advice, if you're going on a trip, would be rent some lenses. Definitely. And then you know that you have the tool that you might need to get the shot that you can see, and try and master the lens that you do have. Kind of hope that answers the question, or at least sheds a bit of light on it, because I know that it's a really frustrating topic, especially if you're new to photography. You just go, you should get this lens or this. Oh man, it drive you crazy. It drove me crazy. And they're so expensive. You can't just go and pick up both of them. So yeah, there you go. Stress about the lens. Try instead to just be okay with not getting an epic image every time you go out. It's designed to make you want more. It shows you the best images, the best, the brightest, the most epic photographs. Instagram is just constantly refreshing with these unattainable images that aren't even real. And that just makes you think that, maybe it's the lens. It's just awful. Just understand that what you see online isn't reality. Most people don't get a shot every time they go out.
What camera lenses and what focal lengths are best for landscape photography. The more popular or more common focal lengths are the 10 to 24, the 16 to 35, the 24 to 70, maybe even the 24 to 105, and a 70 to 200. I want to share with you the 2 remaining lenses that I have left after selling nearly all of my camera equipment over the past 2 years, why I decided to stick with this specific 2 lens combination, why I decided to get rid of everything else, and why I now regret that decision. Over the past 2 years, I've made a real concerted effort to reduce the amount of camera gear I own. And I used to own a total of 6 lenses, half of which were prime lenses and the other half were zoom lenses. And of the 2 remaining lenses that I have left today, one of them will probably come as no surprise to any outdoor and landscape photographer, but the other one is a focal length that is much less commonly used for outdoor photography, or I should say landscape photography. But the reason why I decided to choose these specific focal length combination is perhaps what's most important. Half of my lenses used to be prime lenses, and they were great lenses. They were lightweight, they were less expensive than most zoom lenses, and they were extremely sharp. But the issue I had with them is a very obvious one, and it was the fact that they were prime lenses and they lacked that zoom capability. And when I purchased them, of course, I knew that, but I figured that if I needed to zoom in a little bit, I could just zoom with my feet. I could take a couple steps forward, I could take a couple steps backwards. It wouldn't really be that big of an issue. But I found myself in countless situations where I was perhaps at the edge of a cliff or at the edge of a mountain, and I needed just a little bit more reach to compose my shot. Or maybe I was already up to my knees in a stream, or up to my knees in an ocean, and I needed just a few more millimeters to compose that particular image. And I just didn't feel comfortable going any further or any deeper into the water. And I found myself in that situation time and time again. That's really the main reason why I decided to completely abandon prime lenses altogether and stick 100% with zoom lenses. One of my 2 lenses is a wide angle zoom lens. I had to decide between a 10 to 24, a 24 millimeter prime, and a 16 to 35. Now, of course, I got rid of the 24 millimeter prime, and I used the 16 to 35 quite a bit more than the 10 to 24. The 16 to 35, most of the time, my images were shot between 19 and 35 millimeters, which basically tells me I don't really have an appetite to go much wider than 19 millimeters. So it felt a little bit redundant to have a 10 to 24. So I got rid of that and just kept my 16 to 35. And this is the one that I have now. This is the f2.8, and I really do love this focal length. It's probably the lens that I use most often for landscape photography. It's a very versatile lens. Of course, you can capture images like this, where you just got lots of left to right real estate that kind of create those images that they're very immersive images. They feel like you could almost walk into them. A lot of these types of photographs kind of naturally resemble the focal length of the human eye, if you will. So they feel a little bit natural. It feels as if something that you would see just looking out your window. So these types of images are fantastic. Right here's another great example of just a large sweeping vista from the left to the right. And here's another image from Moab where you almost feel like you can just walk right into this photograph. But perhaps my most favorite aspect of this focal length is the fact that it's very versatile. You can put it in a vertical orientation and capture just a lot of north-south real estate, a lot of top-down real estate in your overall photograph. If you were to actually go to my website, almost all of my images are captured in this vertical orientation. I absolutely love this style of photography. I think it's great to get very up close to large objects. It's also amazing at creating depth in your overall photograph. So identifying areas of clear foreground and midground and background, which creates that depth or that three-dimensional quality to images. And I also love the natural distortion that comes with a wide-angle lens. You can use that to your benefit and just unlock a whole nother level of creativity. You can make things in your foreground appear substantially larger. You can make mountains in your background appear taller, because one of the issues with the wide-angle lens is that make things in your background appear that they're even farther away, which ultimately will make mountains feel like they're a little bit smaller. But if you just angle your camera down a little bit, you can actually stretch those mountains back out. But there's just a lot of versatility with this lens. Like I said, just creating depth, just enlarging things in the foreground. This little patch of grass was not that big, but getting up close to it with a wide-angle lens and just creates a lot of depth in this overall photograph. Where this cactus seems huge, it really wasn't that big, but it was because I was just a few inches away from it, and it creates a lot of depth in this photograph as well. So using a 16 to 35 millimeter lens is fantastic. It's not all roses though. One of my biggest issues with this lens or this focal length is very weather dependent. It's very sky dependent. So basically, if we go back and look at some of these images, almost all of these have the sky in them. Not all of them. What happens a lot of times is that if you don't have an interesting sky, if it's just a completely blue sky with no clouds, that can ruin your photograph because this focal length is very wide. So whether you're using it in a landscape orientation or you're using it in a vertical orientation, 9 times out of 10, unless you're shooting woodland, you're probably going to capture a lot of that sky. And if the sky is not interesting, that could ruin your photograph. So I find that this lens is weather dependent, is sky dependent, whether or not you can actually pull this off. And this is kind of one of the reasons why this specific lens combination I went with works so well in my opinion. The second lens that I went with is this. This is the Sony G Master, the 100 to 400. And this is an absolutely amazing lens. I used to have a 70 to 200, and what I found was almost all of my shots were between 125 or maybe even 135 and 200. So it was all towards the end of that focal length in 200. So it was all towards the end of that focal length range. It basically told me, and I remember being on location, I always wanted more. I always needed more reach for my telephoto, but this 100 to 400 is an absolute dream. I love it. Once again, it's a very expensive lens. It's a G Master lens, but there's definitely less expensive 100 to 400 or super telephoto style lenses you can go after. But once again, much like the wide angle lens, a very versatile lens. And here's a good example right here. So this is an image shot with a wide angle lens, and if I put on my 100 to 400, I was able to zoom into this area right here and capture this image. Or I was able to zoom in even further and capture this up close image of Falls. So being able to have this for my wide angle shot, put on the 100 to 400, zoom in and capture this image, and then zoom in even farther and capture this image is just a great example of the versatility of this lens. And using this in combination with a wide angle lens is absolutely fantastic. I think it's an amazing combination. And remember what I was mentioning about weather dependency and cloud dependency? This is a great example right here. So this is from, once again, from Yosemite, and this is Half Dome. This is shot with a wide angle lens. In the sky, it was just not cooperating. The light was there, the sun was setting, but the sky was just very bland, and it was really ruining my shot. And I tried to compose this to where I included as little of the sky as I possibly could without it getting too close to the top of Half Dome. But I decided to put on the 100 to 400, and I captured this image. And I like this image quite a bit better, but you can still see at the very top of it, it has even more of a bland sky because you really can't see hardly any clouds at all, except for right here. And then I zoomed all the way into 400 millimeters to this region right here, and I love where the light meets the shadow, where the warmth meets the coolness. But being able to go from this and the sky wasn't cooperating. Zooming in a little bit more with the telephoto lens, the sky just still kind of ruined the shot a little bit. And then zooming all the way into this really kind of saved the day for this particular image. And that's exactly what I mean, as this one, this lens here is not as sky dependent as a wide angle lens. It's going to be tough sometimes to keep the sky out of this shot, but with this lens, you can kind of get away with it. So it makes me feel comfortable knowing that if the weather is not cooperating on a particular shoot, that I can always put on this long lens and capture something a little bit more intimate, basically to where the entire, I guess, shoot isn't a complete wash just because the weather wasn't cooperating, which we know in landscape photography happens probably more than half the time. The weather dictates a lot of the outcome of our photography. And I find that these two focal lengths really help to, I guess, put me in a position to where the weather doesn't quite determine the successful likelihood of a particular shoot. And plus, once again, I mentioned it was a very versatile lens. It's not weather dependent. It's also amazing at isolating a subject. So right here, and I had the 100-400 on, and I was just looking for interesting pockets of light. And here's another image right here where you're just able to zoom in and just capture just the peak of this cliff face, and it just made for just a more interesting photograph than using the wide angle lens where it was just basically just capturing just a giant cloud, and I would have lost this detail. And just zooming into the intimate details like this image right here and just capturing these. I love the just the subtle, I guess, detail and texture in this tree. And just zooming in, I think this is zoomed all the way into 400 millimeters. Getting those intimate details is just absolutely fantastic with this 100-400 lens. And then of course, the most obvious reason to use a telephoto or a super telephoto lens is that compression and being able to take things that appear very far away and kind of compress them together. But being able to just kind of compress everything from El Capitan to half dome and make them appear much closer, as opposed to if I used a wide angle zoom lens, everything in the background would have been just kind of just much smaller than it looked like in real life. And here's another great example from Santa Barbara where you were able to just get these layers in these trees and these rolling hills. It didn't really look like this in real life, but zooming in, actually I think I even had a teleconverter on this, so this was probably around 600 millimeters, really compressed this scene together, and it just made for a much more interesting image. So the versatility of this lens is absolutely off the charts, and in combination with this lens makes me feel that this is really all that I need. Now there are some cons to this, some downsides. I guess the main one being the fact that it is heavy. This lens is substantially heavier than this lens, and I think that's going to go with any kind of a super telephoto lens, or really any kind of long lens. If you're ever using a lens like this that kind of telescopes out very far, and if you have a very long lens hood that goes on the end of it like this, when you put this on a tripod, you really want to make sure that you are able to steady this. And I would highly recommend using a 10-second timer just to let it completely stabilize before you take the shot. And if there's any kind of a breeze, you might have to take this lens hood off, because a lot of times it's hard to keep a super telephoto lens very still, especially if you're shooting a longer exposure. So using as long of a self-timer as you possibly can is a good best practice with this type of a lens. But these two lens combinations puts me in a position to feel comfortable that, one, I have the flexibility and the versatility to capture pretty much anything that the landscape presents me, and it enables me to capture pretty much anything that the weather presents as well. So when the weather doesn't cooperate, I can always put this lens on and still capture intimate details or isolate subjects in the landscape as well. So these are the two lenses I went with, and the biggest regret that I have is, honestly, and it sounds kind of ridiculous, it's the fact that I just did not do this sooner. I used to have, like I mentioned, 6 lenses, and I spent well over $10,000 on those lenses, and I didn't recoup even maybe half of that. I lost a lot of money on that, and a lot of those lenses I really never even used. And I have been so happy with these two lenses. One, because I can bring everything everywhere now. It doesn't weigh a ton, it doesn't kill my back, and it's just much more comfortable to hike with on location. And probably the best part is when I look in my bag, I don't have to make a ton of different decisions. This is what I was talking about earlier about streamlining my workflow. The only decision I have to make is, do I want to go wide or do I want to go long? And that's it. That's the only two decisions I need to make when it comes to picking my specific lenses.
I gotta admit, there's not a whole lot to photograph right here, but I put on my 28-200 millimeter and basically shooting straight towards the sunset with a composition that looks something like this here. Yeah, my 28-200 millimeter, it's basically my most used lens. Like it's my go-to lens, basically for everything, especially when I'm in a new location. Like 28-200 millimeter is just such a wide focal length. Since I'm shooting into the sun, I'm shooting at like f11, ISO 100, plenty of light, so that gives me a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second. I could maybe lower it to like f8, but I'm all the way out at 200 millimeters, so this is probably good. Looks really epic. It looks really nice. So yeah, I'll just quite heavy, and there's a lot of wind coming in from here, so I'll just like stay low, making sure that the wind is not shaking the camera too much. That's kind of the downside to the Tamarin. There's no inbuilt stabilization. It's all in camera, so it's not always super duper steady.
So I've owned the 28 to 200 millimeter for about a year, and there's no doubt that it is my most used lens. The question is for 2020, where I think that it was my 24-205, that's my most used lens. It's interesting to see how big part of my portfolio could actually have been taken by the 28 to 200 millimeter, or should I just use the 24 to 105 millimeter, because they do overlap quite a lot. So as you can see here, I have collected a lot of my favorite photos into one big folder here, and there are 97 photos. So I've color coded them. All the red ones cover the 23 millimeter, all the yellow are 24 to 105, all the greens are 106 to 200 millimeter, and all the blue are from 200 millimeter or 201 millimeter to 400 millimeters. I've also given some stars, and then I have some with 2 stars. Those fall within the focal length range of 24 to 28 millimeter. So there are only 3 photos where I would have had to use the 24 to 105 millimeter, but usually I have the 16 to 35 millimeter with me when I'm out with the 28 to 200 millimeter. If we just put on all the yellow ones and all the green ones, you can see that they take up the vast majority of my portfolio. So that's 57 photos that has been taken in the range of 28 to 200 millimeter over the past 2 years, and 40 that has been taken outside, whereas 8 of them has been taken with the drone. So it is easy to see that my favorite focal length range is definitely the standard focal length range. If we go in, I only have 15 photos that actually came into my favorite photos the past 2 years that has been taken from 12 to 24 millimeter. But I'm actually not using those super wide angle lenses to create photos that I super interested in. So as mentioned, it's not a huge surprise, because I have a feeling with my own photos that my wide angle photos have a tendency to not last for a long time. However, the photos I have in here that are wide angle, I am actually really happy about them. But as you can see in most of the photos, it's not because that they have that really strong foreground. It's not like, that foreground where the photo is basically like puking the foreground into your face. This one here is probably, and this one here, and this one are probably those where it is the most pronounced, the foreground. But this one here, I was very close to the bubbles. And this one here, yeah, probably something like this. So when it comes to using my wide angle lens, I'm definitely not using it in the sense that I'm using it to really blow the foreground into the face of the viewer. It doesn't really have a big effect on how I like to show my photos. If we go back and then we look at my long lens photos, you can also see that I actually don't have a whole lot of photos that end up being my favorites beyond the 200 millimeters. And that is actually quite interesting, because I have had the 100 to 400 for a long time. Well, at least the past couple of years. And even though I use it a lot, I think for some reason those photos don't really end up having a longevity for me either. That being said, I am really happy about these photos, these 9 photos. So what I can conclude definitely based on all this is that my favorite focal length range is mainly between 24 to 200 millimeter, and it's probably more like 30 millimeter to 150-ish millimeter. If there's any lens manufacturers out there who want to make super sharp lens at all apertures from edge to edge throughout the entire focal length range from 30 to 150 millimeter, you have a buyer. So what can we actually learn from all of this? Well, basically, as what I've said for the most part, make sure that you should probably optimize your gear in a sense so that you have as few lenses that cover the widest amount of focal lengths as possible, yet make sure that you do not compromise on the image quality in those focal lengths that you use the most. I guess it's always hard to talk about gear. Just get the lenses that works for you and get the job done. Produces the photos that you are the most satisfied with. I think that must be the conclusion.
I'm going to be talking about my 3 favourite landscape photography lenses. It's a super wide 16 to 35 millimeter lens. On my Fuji, it's my 10 to 24 lens. In the middle window, it's the fast nifty 50. So this is a 50 millimeter Sigma 1.4 lens. I absolutely love this lens. And in the left-hand window, the 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens. If I could have any lens for landscape photography, I probably would just take this one lens. So I want to talk about my lenses because I think the most important thing is just getting out and taking photos. I think what camera you've got doesn't make a huge amount of difference. So what you're going to want to do is get better lenses, because lenses can make a significant improvement and change what you're trying to do for composition. So let's start with the lens that's most synonymous with landscape photography. On my Nikon, I use the 16 to 35 millimeter f4. Now, the reason I use this over the other wide angle that's slightly much easier to use, the reason that I like a super wide angle lens more than probably the sort of 24 millimeter lens is at that sort of 16 millimeters, you get a different perspective on things. So things change. And part of the thing in photography is trying to come up with an image that's creative and different. So by using a different perspective, then that can make a big difference. I also love using the wide angle lens on my Fuji X-T2. Now I use the 10 to 24 millimeter lens. It's so good, this lens. I can focus on the furthest subject, and 10 millimeters and around about f10, everything's going to be sharp down to my feet pretty much. Okay, so let's talk about focus and a super wide angle lens, because that's something that comes up a lot and it's my top tip for when you're using a wide angle lens. So I quite often use this 10 to 24 millimeter lens. Obviously you can have a reasonably slow shutter speed. It's got iOS on it, so I can probably go down to about 1/10 of a second quite easily and hand hold it. So it means that I can take lots of landscape shots with this camera and this lens combination. But when I focus at such a wide focal length, then it's really easy to get everything in focus. There's a lot of talk about hyperfocal distance, and people always say to me, why don't you use hyperfocal distance? Well, the reason I don't is it's just too complicated. Obviously, it's the most accurate method of getting the most out of your lens and the best way of focusing your lens and camera combination. But if I can just show you this, I've got photo pills here on my phone, and hopefully you can see this. I've set it up at Fuji X-T2, 10 millimeters at f8, and I've focused at 1,000 meters, so that's infinity effectively. And that means that I can focus as close as 62 centimeters. I now know that if pretty much everything's going to be in focus, I can get flowers really close to me in focus, and I know that I can nail it every time. I don't have to calculate the hyperfocal distance. And that's one of the reasons I love using a wide angle lens. I just don't have to worry about focus too much. I put it on f8, it's a really good part of the lens. It just means that I can get everything in focus. And these photos here that will appear have been taken with my Fuji X-T2 handheld at exactly those settings, and I love it for those reasons. I can do exactly the same as well with my 16 to 35 millimeter on my Nikon. Okay, so my next lens is the Nifty 50. The reason I like this prime lens so much is, and the ones I use are a Sigma 50mm f1.4 for my Nikon and a 35mm f2 for my Fuji. I find that a prime lens is just a great way of improving your photography. By actually reducing the options that you've got, reducing the fact that you can't zoom in and zoom out, you've got to move with your feet to get the composition, means it actually improves your photography. You've got to think about the composition a little bit more. So I really like it for that reason, but also the optics on these lenses are usually really good. So certainly on this Fuji 35mm lens, the optics are just amazing. I took this photo here that is showing now and that was taken with my Fuji 35mm lens. It's just superb optics, and there's lots for Canon or Panasonic or Sony that are exactly the same. They're usually really, really good optics. The other thing is that you can get creative with them as well. So they're usually a really large aperture, so f1.4 in this case and f2 in this case. So it means that you can have some great bokeh on it as well. Of my three lenses that I love for landscape photography is this long lens. So in my case, I use the 70 to 200. I absolutely love this lens. This is the first generation, so I think I've had this for maybe 10 years. There's just so many things that I like about using a long lens. It allows you on poor quality, light quality days to really get in close, cut out the sky. You might have blue sky, it might be overcast and dull. So you can cut that sky out and look at elements of the landscape. Maybe it's a ridge or maybe part of a mountain. With stabilization, you can handhold it as well. So I took this shot, the cloud was just coming over and then this cloud just disappeared. And as I was taking it, if I hadn't been able to just get my camera out of my bag, stick my long lens on and just handhold it, I would have missed this shot. The 70 to 200 allowed me to get this moment. Then the other thing you can do with it is intimate landscapes. So you can get close. You can use it instead of a macro lens, about how you can get really amazing out of focus with this lens as well, just like the 1.4 50mm, but with the 70mm it really compresses the perspective as well, so you can pick out a flower, and by just putting something just in front of the lens you can have out of focus foreground and out of focus background, and that allows you to be super creative with this 70 to 200mm lens.
I want to tackle the topic of which lenses should you buy for landscape photography. Here is my insight after being a professional photographer for nearly 20 years and shooting for decades. Which lenses have been the most important to me, why I made those choices, what they have done for my photography and my creativity, and perhaps what mistakes I could have avoided had I watched this video 20 years ago. To my Lightroom catalog, the metadata gives me an awful lot of information as to what are the lenses that I have been using most over my last 20 plus years. I have three lenses that I have used more than any other. There are three lenses sat on my desk beside me that have been my three go-to lenses for the majority of my working career. I started with Canon. So obviously I invested in Canon glass first. In 2007 I swapped to Nikon, and in 2023 moved from Nikon to Fuji. I started as a bird photographer. My very first lens was a 300 f4, which is not usually everyone's first choice. The first one here is a 12mm prime. This is a Laowa. This is the go-to wide-angled lens that I used predominantly in the late 2000s. The reason I went down that road was that the equivalent sort of 14 to 24, which was the kind of go-to wide-angled lens, certainly for Nikon shooters, it was big and bulky and it was very difficult to get filters for. This lens allowed me to use ND filters and polarizers and grads, and therefore it ticked a lot of boxes. And the first piece of advice I would give anybody who's thinking of investing in a wide-angled lens is to realize first and foremost that they are incredibly difficult to use well. It is very easy to buy a wide-angled lens because a lot of the photography taken with them is incredibly impressive. But there is a downside to that, and I would say the majority of people who have wide-angled lenses are not getting the most out of them because they present extreme technical and processing challenges to get the most out of them. If I was starting out to give someone some advice today, I would say probably don't start with a wide-angled lens. The next lens that's probably in most people's bags would be something along these lines, and this is a Nikon 24 to 70 f2.8. This is probably the most common focal length. It gives you something of the wide end, it gives you something at the zoom end, it allows you to zoom in a wee bit closer, but also gives you some of those wider angled perspectives. This kind of go-to middle zoom is a very popular choice, and a very large percentage of my images were taken with it. In fact, 45% of all my Nikon images were in fact taken with that lens. I think 24-70s are a really good focal range. F2.8 opens up possibilities for shooting at night. They're not horribly heavy. I think, I don't know, I'd be guessing that this is about 850, 900 grams maybe. I would say that as a first lens, it can be a very, very good choice. It's certainly, in terms of its weight to flexibility ratio, I think that is a really good way to go. We do talk about normal lenses, focal range of between kind of 45 to 50 millimeters. And what that really means is that the way you see the world in terms of the magnification and the visual relationships that present themselves to you are typically at that kind of 45 to 50 mil range. So it seems to make sense that if you want to portray reality in the way that you're seeing it, then using that kind of middle zoom is a good way to go. As soon as we start going wider, we are corrupting visual relationships between foregrounds, midgrounds, and backgrounds. And again, once we start doing that, we end up in a situation where you need to develop your craft, you need to spend time understanding the implications and consequences of these compositional decisions. But a 24-70 pretty much has to be in every camera bag of every photographer. Incredibly versatile, and it gives you that kind of best of both worlds. The third lens, which I have actually used most in my Nikon days, makes up 48%, is this here. And this is my Nikon 80 to 400 mil lens. For those of you who are familiar with my Out of Darkness photo book, the vast majority of the photographs in that book were taken with that lens. The reason I love the longer focal length so much is that it's actually very, very easy to shoot with a long lens. You're eliminating things in abundance. You can zone in on small details. You can photograph things that are far away. And that wide focal length, I guess the other equivalent would be something like 100 to 400. Anything that's going to get you out there in terms of those longer focal lengths is an incredible way to simplify busy landscapes. I use long focal lengths to create shallow depth of field that creates an incredible sense of atmosphere in photography. I also use it to highlight things that catch my eye in big landscape. The problem with using a wide-angled lens is everything has to work. Nowhere to hide. The landscape has to be harmonious and everything has to fit in the frame the way you want it to. There are lots of challenges with the wide-angled lenses. So in terms of ease of use, I think the longer lenses are easier to use, and as you get down to wider focal lengths, they actually get harder to use, particularly raising more processing issues. Next, and then the wide-angled stuff is my least go-to thing. And I think your lens choices tell you something about who you are as a photographer or who you may want to be as a photographer. Certainly in my earlier days, in the early 2000s, I was very much driven by a desire to be liked, to be popular, to build a business, to be recognized as a competent photographer. My peers at that time were all using wide-angled lenses. And using wide-angled lenses was a way to create impressive images, majestic scenes. They all tend to be very expansive, very, very dramatic, very powerful in their drama and awe factor. But as I got a bit more mature with my own photography, and in particular after spending so much time in the Gobi between 17 and 19, I got into the longer lenses and found that I could make much more personal images and images that were so much more me. And that was a hugely important thing for me. It's not unusual for photographers to have financial constraints. I know plenty of amateur photographers with $30,000 worth of kit, because they can afford to buy that. I know plenty of people with lenses that just sit on the shelf and they never use them. I have been there, I have done that. I bought a lens because I thought it was going to be this whole new adventure that would change my creativity, and rarely is that the case. So if I was going to make a recommendation for people, a medium zoom is always going to be a good bet. That 24 to 70 range is an absolute go-to, and I would always recommend it. But I would equally recommend something on the longer end, 80 to 400, 100 to 400, something like that, something that you can zoom right in on. You're not worried about having a big wide aperture. You're not going to be shooting particularly in low light. It's more about focal length. I'm sharing it because I wish I'd known these things 10, 15, 20 years ago. I would have saved myself a fortune. I would have saved myself an awful lot of headaches. I would have shared myself an awful lot of angst.
Picking the right lens. So whether you're snapping shots of, say, a mountain range or capturing tiny details on the forest floor, the lens that you choose can really up your chances of a great shot. I think choosing the right lens is so important. Choosing the right lens can be key, but a few things to consider when choosing a lens would be what we intend to shoot, what conditions we intend to shoot in, and what we're going to be using those images for. Let me just expand on those three things just for a second. So firstly, what do we intend to shoot will dictate the focal length that is required. For me, I would never go into the mountains or hills like this without a telephoto lens, because that longer focal length is great for picking out distant details. On the flip side though, I tend to use a wide angle lens a lot less often when I'm in the hills. At the coast though, I use a wide angle lens quite a lot and a telephoto lens less often. So location and style of shooting can often dictate your lens choice. Secondly, what conditions we intend to shoot in. So if you never venture out when it's wet or dusty, you might not need to invest the extra money in weather sealing your lens. For me, weather sealing is super important as I shoot, a lot of seascapes, and the weather here in Wales most of the time is pretty wet. Might not be the case for you. Thirdly, what will the images be used for? So if you intend to make, say, massive prints or sell your work for commercial gain, then it's likely you will require the very best optics that are available. But if not, then I guess a question to ask yourself is, do I actually need that extra tiny little bit of lens sharpness that I might get from a very high-end lens? And is it really worth the extra investment? So as landscape photographers, we're quite lucky in lots of ways, because we tend to shoot most of our images around the sweet spot of a lens. And that's because quite often we want to get the most sharpness from front to back in our image. And to do this, we tend to shoot at apertures between f7.1 and probably about f11. And what we find is even entry-level lenses perform really well through this aperture range. It's when the aperture is either fully open or fully closed that cheap lenses tend to become very soft, especially in the corners. I think with pro lenses, you're paying for consistency through that focal and aperture range. But the sweet spot, that difference can be very, very marginal. I just want to talk about primes versus zooms, because I think that's really important. And it's a massive debate, and everyone will have slightly different opinions on this. But if I was just shooting daytime landscapes, I would have 3 zoom lenses: a wide angle, a standard zoom, and a telephoto zoom, because this offers the most amount of flexibility. However, I like to dabble in astrophotography from time to time, so I actually swapped out my wide angle zoom lens for a prime lens. And this is the lens that I went for. It's the Viltrox 13mm f1.4. This lens is wide enough for most of my daytime wide angle photography and is super sharp down to about f1.8, which is great for shooting the Milky Way because it lets in a lot of light, and it's a really versatile lens in that regard. With prime lenses, they're just one focal length, aren't they? But they tend to get, I guess, better image quality than you can expect from a zoom lens. And I think aside from their larger aperture, this is one of their biggest plus points. The downside, of course, is that if you've got a bag full of primes, then it's going to leave some big gaps in your focal range. If you had zooms, basically all of those bases are covered. I think these gaps are probably more noticeable as well when we get to the wider end of the focal range, so maybe that is something to bear in mind as well. Now, prime lenses can be great from a creative point of view, as working within the constraints of a single focal length means we'll need to zoom with our feet. I think the only problem for this for landscape photography though is quite often we're kind of confined to a very tight space. We can't actually move sometimes. Say for example you're on a mountain path, we might not be able to move forwards or backwards. We're just stuck where we are. So for me, this is why I would always recommend zooms over prime lenses, especially if you're just starting out with landscape photography. So I've got a tool that will help you to determine your favorite lens for landscape photography. If you already own a few lenses, a great way to find your most used focal length is by using this super powerful hidden tool that's in Lightroom's library module. To use it, come up to the library module, then go to View at the top and check Show Filter Bar. Make sure you've selected your primary folder on the left so your entire entire photo collection is included. Next, ensure all dates, cameras and focal lengths are selected from the top drop-down menus. Now you can scroll through the different focal lengths to see which ones you use the most. For example, I found that I have about 1500 shots at the 13mm and just over 1600 shots at the 16mm range. And this shows that I frequently use very wide end of my standard zoom and obviously my 13mm prime lens. But here's where it gets interesting. By looking through the entire zoom range, you can see the focal lengths that you naturally favour. You will likely notice spikes in certain areas like I did with 28mm. And this is such a powerful tool and can really help you decide where to invest your money, especially if you're looking to upgrade perhaps one of your cheaper lenses. If I had to pick one lens for landscape photography, it would have to be my most used lens, which is this, the standard zoom lens. In full frame terms, that's 24-70. For me, on APS-C, that's 16-55. I've actually got a couple of standard zoom lenses. Now, this one is a kit lens with a variable aperture between f2.8 and f4, and this one is a pro constant f2.8 lens. And as you can see, the difference in size and weight is quite a lot. In terms of image quality though, at the sweet spot of these lenses between f7.1 and f11, the image quality is very, very similar. The only difference in these two lenses really, for me, for landscape photography, is the fact that the Pro version is weather sealed and this kit version is not, which means I tend to favour the weather sealed lens. There's a new version of this kit lens, I think it's actually out now, which is in fact weather sealed, so I'm going to be taking a look at that, which I think might help reduce some of the weight in my pack. So I would actually advise looking at f4 lenses over f2.8s, as usually the image quality is going to be similar at those mid apertures. The size, the weight and the cost is likely to be a lot less, which is going to be a massive bonus. So I think the 24-70 zoom range offers so much flexibility for landscape, and it's definitely a lens I just couldn't be without. Let's find a composition for sunset. Framed it up 16:9, f10 to get everything sharp from front to back, 40th of a second, and then I'm going to spin round to see if I can get a shot behind me, because you might just be able to see. Lots to shoot from this one vantage point. Absolutely brilliant. So the light is absolutely incredible right now, super bright as you can probably tell by the exposure of my face, and I've chosen to shoot on this rocky outcrop and I'm bracketing my shots. Currently I'm at 40th second f9 and that is for my lightest frame, and then I'm just adjusting my shutter speed as required for the other frames just to get the full exposure, because I'm shooting straight towards the light, blend those images together in post-production.
So let's break down the variables in lens types and language that we need to understand. So if you want to buy a lens, the salesperson there will ask you what you want in the following 4 attributes: focal length, prime versus zoom, aperture, and mount type. Let's start with focal length. But generally, people talk about focal length as if it's the same as lens length. It's usually written right on the lens in millimeters. This is a 500mm lens, while this is a 50mm lens. The main attribute that this figure tells you about the lens is its field of view. That is, how wide or narrow an image it will produce. The shorter the focal length, the wider the field of view it sees, or the less magnification. The longer the focal length, the smaller field of view, so the more zoomed up it looks, the more magnification. So on my full frame camera, this is what 16mm looks like. This is called an ultra wide angle lens. This is what you would use for wide landscape photos, or maybe photos of indoors for real estate photography to get a wide view of a room. I use this type of lens for shooting Milky Way shots, as I need a wide field of view to capture a large swath of sky and a foreground subject all in one view. At 30mm, we're no longer ultra wide, but this is still a wide angle. Great for landscapes, but also photographing people where showing their surroundings or location is important. Think of a photo of your friend with Machu Picchu in the background. Then there's 50mm, often considered a standard focal length. This is what some people would refer to as the same field of view as your vision. You can photograph portraits with this, architecture, or smaller views of landscapes. Then there's 200mm. This is getting into telephoto range, where it's not enough for wildlife, but a wider shot of several people playing sports, a mountain in the distance, or close-up portraits of people just showing their upper body or face. And finally, 500mm, like from my big lens. People call these super telephotos. This is for wildlife or sports, up close. And as a wildlife photographer, this is my lens of choice for getting close and getting lots of detail. Here's a quick rundown of the field of view they all show compared to each other. Now this field of view is impacted by another variable, sensor size. What I've been showing you so far was shot on a full frame camera. That's because smaller sensors capture only a smaller crop of what the lens can capture. For sensors that are called crop sensors, also known as APS-C, you need to multiply the focal length by 1.5 or 1.6 for Canon to give you what the effective focal length is compared to a full-frame sensor. So this 50mm lens field of view on a crop sensor is the same as 75mm on a full-frame camera. For micro four thirds cameras with an even smaller sensor, the crop factor is 2 times. The next critical attribute of a lens is its maximum aperture. This is usually written right on the lens in its f number. F-number scale can be a bit confusing as it's actually a ratio of the lens focal length and its aperture, the size of its opening, and works in reverse. So my 500mm focal length lens has a 125mm aperture, technically what's called the entrance pupil, so it's f4. Lenses with the smallest numbers have the largest maximum apertures. So an f2.8 lens has a wider aperture than f5.6. There are 2 major attributes impacted by the maximum aperture on the lens. The first is the light gathering capacity of the lens, with the widest apertures collecting the most light. These are called fast lenses as they allow faster exposures due to their ability to collect lots of light. These are valued where light is a scarce commodity like dark music venues. So the scale works in units called stops and goes like this, starting at very, very fast apertures of, let's say, f1.4, which I use for astrophotography because you need lots and lots of light. f2.8 collects less light but is still considered fast and is popular for indoor photography or shooting a dark wedding reception where you need all the light you can get. f4 or f5.6 are very common apertures in the lenses that often come with your camera. These don't capture as much light and may be difficult to use in dark environments. And some lenses can even be f6.3 or 7.1 or f8 in long lenses for wildlife because making large apertures for telephoto lenses can be quite expensive. The second attribute that is determined by the aperture or the f number of the lens is its ability to blur out the background by having a thin depth of field. That is a thin plane that's in focus compared to everything else being out of focus. Wider apertures make for smoother, blurrier backgrounds, valued in many types of photography by making your subject stand out in the photo and blurring distracting elements in the background. I use this in my wildlife photography by using the blurry background as a way of making my wildlife stand out. This is also very popular in portrait photography, for example, where you might want to calm or make blurry a busy background behind your subject. When you shoot your lens wide open, a low f number, the background gets blurrier. A smaller aperture makes more of the background more in focus. Because light gathering capacity and blurring the background are valued by many in photography, large aperture lenses like this 50mm f1.4 lens are often prized by photographers. Unfortunately, manufacturing them to a high quality with these large lens elements is also expensive. So we've covered the focal length and the aperture so far, the 2 main attributes. These are usually written right on the side of your lens. Now you can also separate lenses into 2 main types, prime lenses and zoom lenses. Prime lenses are of a fixed focal length, like 50mm, 16mm, or 500mm. They are built to work at just one focal length. On the other hand, zoom lenses are built with an adjustable focal length, which can cover a maximum to a minimum range. So this 17 to 40 covers 17mm at the wide end to 40mm at the longer end. The main attractiveness of zoom lenses is the flexibility and adaptability they have. Depending on the scene, you can adjust the focal length. Where you can't zoom with your feet or get closer or farther from your subject, zooms are a great way to either change the field of view you can capture or change the size of your subject in the frame. If an elephant or a giraffe comes up really close, it's not going to fit into the field of view of my 500mm lens. So here's the 100 to 400 zoom to the rescue. I'll just widen the field of view to 100 or 200mm and voila, I can fit it into my frame. The same goes for landscapes. Do you want the waterfall small in the frame or big in the frame? Now, if you can tweak all these things with a twist on your lens, why then would you even want to get a prime lens with a fixed focal length? One is that zoom lenses come with sacrifices. When the optical engineers who designed them put them together, they need them to be decently sharp at a wide range of focal lengths, and as such, need to make trade-offs. Zooms are often not as sharp as primes, and also primes can usually be designed to be faster, that is, have even larger apertures. So here's the trade-off. Do you want to have one lens that can be more flexible and used in various circumstances, Or is more light gathering capacity and blurrier backgrounds worth having to carry 2 or 3 lenses for the different focal lengths and having to change lenses for different shots? There's no right or wrong for this. Myself, I like a prime lens for top light gathering capacity for Milky Way shots, and also I like a prime lens for extreme sharpness for wildlife. But for landscapes, I like the flexibility of a zoom lens. Now, before you run off to buy a lens, a few more things you need to consider. 1, camera lenses come with different mount types, that is made to fit different camera types, sensor sizes, and brands. These mounts are not all the same. So for example, if your camera is a Sony E-mount, you need to get a lens that also fits on an E-mount. So lenses also have differing mount types, and you need to get the right one to fit on your camera. Now, manufacturers of cameras make lenses that can fit into their own mounts, but there are also third-party manufacturers that also make lenses with mounts made to attach to different camera brands. This lens is made by Sigma, but it's designed to fit a Canon camera. If I had a Sony camera, I need to buy the version of this lens made for Sony with a Sony mount. Note also that some lenses are made for larger full-frame sensors and project an image large enough to cover the whole sensor. And some lenses are made specifically to cover smaller crop sensors, so illuminate a smaller area. But can you use one on the other? On some brands you can. On most cameras, you can put a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera and it will work because the mounts are the same and the large image circle projected will cover the smaller chip. But most brands, except Canon, will also allow you to put a crop sensor lens on a full-frame camera. But there's an issue. The small image circle projected doesn't illuminate the whole sensor, so you end up with what's called vignetting, like this. You can either crop your image, or some cameras will even auto-detect these lenses and crop it for you. So they will work, but often you end up with a cropped image and you lose lots of megapixels in the process. So they work, but the use cases get really limited. Before you buy a lens, you should also check out these important attributes. Let's run through some of them quickly. One is the minimum focus distance. The closer it can focus, the more magnification you can get. This 100 to 400 lens can focus at 3 feet. Very close. There's also something called a macro lens, designed specifically with a very, very close minimum focus distance, allowing you to get extreme close-ups like bugs or like in this shot. Some lenses have better weather sealing so they can handle the rain and the snow. Make sure that your camera is similarly weather sealed before relying on this. Another lens attribute is the thread size. The thread size is the size of the front element in case you want to use filters. If you buy lenses with the same thread size, you can use the same filters on different lenses. For example, this 77mm filter will fit okay on either this lens or this one, avoiding me needing to buy different filters for different lenses. Some lenses come with image stabilization and some not. If it has image stabilization, you can shoot at lower shutter speeds and still get sharp photos. If you shoot mostly on a tripod or shoot really, really wide, this is less important. But if you shoot really long focal lengths, this is more important, almost critical. As a bonus tip, when you get a new camera, there's a way you can avoid needing to buy new lenses, or even use lenses with different lens mounts or from different brands. Adapters. Adapters are designed to accept a camera mount on one side and another different type of lens mount on the other. There's usually no glass, and the job is just to be a conduit for the 2 different mount types with connectors for the electronics so they can speak to each other. I've used these very successfully to use my older Canon DSLR lenses on my new Canon mirrorless cameras, as they have different mounts. There's no image quality loss in my particular combination, as there's no glass element. It's just a spacer. I can even use my big 500mm lens on my little Canon M50. So if you have lenses and are buying a new camera, see if there are adapters that would allow you to use your old lenses. You can even adapt old vintage lenses, but usually this will leave you focusing manually. Using adapters is a good way of easing into the cost of a new camera by not having to rush out and buy new lenses right away. Just make sure that your combinations will work.